Okay, looks like we're good. Everybody know you're being recorded. Okay. I want to share now. Thanks for reminding me, Gary. See, that's what I need every week. Somebody to remind me to do that.
Between me and Chris, I know we'll make it happen.
We're good, Mike. We see your screen.
Okay, I'm trying to get my screen set up so I can see it better myself. Well, now I lost my screen. Hold on, guys. There we go. You still seeing it?
Yes.
Okay. I'm in the course, and at the beginning, I've got the syllabus set here, and we'll look at that if we can, if we need to. Again, like I said, you need to point to me and by email to issues that you have on the schedule. It's a very crowded schedule. We really didn't have a lot of time from the time that I accepted it to get to the syllabus, so I just left it like it was, so I'm not as familiar with it. So it's not a hand in a glove situation. So, but we'll just push our way through it. Grading points, I've got the presentation assignments. You've seen those. I put all indented here under the syllabus, administrative things for the course. And the debate assignments there. And really, that's a major assignment. I don't want you to miss both of those. I can shuffle guys from one to the other, but I don't want you to miss both. We've got to figure the schedule out to make that happen. And then obviously you have to present your research papers the last class. Okay. And we'll work on how long that's going to be. Obviously you can't take an hour to make your presentation, so we'll have to work on that. And I had this document here that I'll pull it up. Do you see it coming up? Okay. I tried to go have a kind of a global place you could go and see all the things that you have to do on any given day for the class. So the A classes. So what you need to do, when we make adjustments, I'll come back to this document and change it to fit so everybody knows. I want to make sure we're all on the same page. So make sure and look at that. We've got next week, for example, the reading and book review of Geisler's book is due. And and there's a book review of that. You have the book review of as well as the reading. And then we start the lectures on Allison's based on his book. And remember, those are not summaries. What I want you to do is pick out like 6 things. I'm not going to be legalistic about that number, but pick out key points and present those and issues about those in a short way. And I would say what we want you to do is 15 to 20 minutes for that. I'm not talking about a long assignment here because we don't have the time. Okay. And then that allows about 10 minutes to discuss. So think 20 minutes presentation, 10 minutes of discussion. So 30 minutes altogether for those. Then we have the debates. I've got it set up. This is not the formal debate. This is the debate on the book where everybody just presents their opinion of a certain section and defend it. Okay, for example, let me pick one out. I've got Christopher Johnson and David Donnelly listed for Van Hooser in that book. Okay, and Christopher and David, I hate to do that to you, but I can't stand Van Hooser in many, many ways. But I want you to defend him. I want you to defend him. Make a positive present. Do the best you can. Make a positive presentation. Now, Eduardo and Todd, I like Peter Enns even less. Okay, Van Hooser at least believes in functional inerrancy. Enns, I don't think, believes in any kind of inerrancy. That's my opinion. He would word it differently, perhaps. And of course, my third least favorite is John Frankie, Ian, with him. So then Andre has Moeller. So, we look at him, he's kind of got the easy one, but I might be harder on him, Andre. So be careful about that. So, and then we go back to lectures on Allison's book. And the point, Allison's book is a pretty good historical theology book. I do have historical theology, as you'll see here later today, inside of my approach to systematic theology. Some leave it as a separate discipline. I see it as a subset in my taxonomy, a subset of systematic theology. And that's very similar to Lewis and Demarest integrated theology, if you see how they do their systematic theology. So I'm very close to that. And so it'll be helpful to get at the issues. We're doing prolegomena, bibliology, theology proper, and we're going to do a little bit of angelology, but not much. Just to be honest with you, we don't have the time to get to it, but we'll do some. And one of the things I want you to think about as we go through the class is a question that I really bombed in my Ph.D. comprehensive exams at Dallas Seminary. Craig Blazing asked me a question. He was on the committee for my comps. Craig Blazing asked me a question that just took me off guard, but it's a simple question. It's like a Sunday school 6th grade question, but I wasn't prepared for it. And the question is, define God. That was his question, define God. And in the PhD comp, I flunked that question. In fact, I started going down, the Westminster list of attributes of God. And at the end of that, I said, is that what you want? And he said, so far, you haven't said anything that makes me think you're a Christian. A Muslim could say what you've just said. A Orthodox Jewish person could say what you just said. Then I go, oh yeah, there's that Trinity thing. So be thinking about that as we go through the class, define God. I may ask you that later on again. So we look at that. Okay. Are there any questions at this point?
Dr. Stallard, just a very quick question. When you mentioned, let's see, next week when we do the student lectures, we're not critiquing, or I'm sorry, the 5 biblical views on inerrancy. Then the third week, we're not critiquing their view. We're presenting their view and defending their view.
I would like you to do that. I would like you to defend their view.
Okay.
And and you could throw in a little bit of critique, but I'd kind of like, I really want you to make here's their view, present it positively. Here's the way that you would defend their view.
Thank you.
And you learn a lot that way. I've been in debates in classes where I was forced to take a position that I didn't hold to, and I learned a lot. I never changed my mind because of that. But it helped me to be more honest about the other view and not go off the rails. And it helped me to do something else, because sometimes we have our differences are not substantial. Our differences are semantic. Our differences are labeling. And so what I want to do is find out what the labeling differences are. And once we get to the real kernel of the substance that we're disagreeing on, and deal with that. Sometimes we've got to get the labeling stuff out of the way. Okay, any other questions? That's a good question.
Yes, Dr. Stallard, I have a question.
Okay, Christopher, go ahead.
Are you looking for do we need to do a PowerPoint presentation for that, or do we
Well,
need
if you
any
have
visual?
a PowerPoint, it shouldn't be longer than 1 or 2 slides. It just a list of, and it could be a Word document that you just present that just has a 1 page, and here are 6 points I want to talk about.
Okay.
That I disagree with. It doesn't have to be long drawn out, because remember, Okay, we've got 7 of you. If everybody can do it in 3 hours, so do the math. That's not a full 30 minutes for each of you. So it has to be less. So we're talking about 15 to 20 minutes, kind of a presentation and then discussion. Now, if a major discussion erupts in the class that I feel like we need to pursue, we'll pursue it. And I may push things back to the next week, but we've got so much other stuff going on, we've got to be careful. Because one thing we can't push to the next week is the last week. Okay, so we just have to work through it the best that we can together. Okay. Okay, so the 2 places, the documents, the document for student assignments is helpful, and then the overall modules here as you see that. So, but if you go to the files section, that's where my notes are. Okay, now you look at those notes. We don't have time to go through all my notes. I just put them up there for your as resources for you. We will go through some of my notes, but not a lot of them. Okay, I have a 4-page document that we're going to go over right now, which outlines my approach to systematic theology. And that document, oftentimes when I present it in a PhD class in the past, has taken up 3 hours of time. So you're free to ask questions. And tonight's the night you're not making any presentations. This is my time to talk. Not that I won't do any talking later, but this is my time to do most of the talking. PhD classes are generally not overly on the lecture side. There's a lot of student participation in it. So that's generally how that goes. I rarely had a lecture. One of the few guys I had at the PhD level that lectured a lot was Norm Geisler. But most of them, it was a discussion. We did reading and we discussed the reading, and that was pretty much, did our papers, and that was pretty much it for most of my PhD studies. So this is a little more directive than that, but anyway, you can look at my notes. So I'm going to pull up my notes here. I'm going to go to a different place to pull up my notes because I think it'll be faster than running it off of the internet. Okay, can everybody see that Word document? You don't see that, okay? I'm going to stop sharing. Share. Do you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. All right, let me walk through this, guys, and feel free to ask a question. Unfortunately, I'm not as familiar with Teams as I am Zoom and Google Meeting and some of the others, but there we go. I got it somehow. I have no idea what I just did, but now I can see you all again. Okay, let me walk through this and feel free to turn your mic on and ask me a question as we go. Okay, I don't want to just at the end ask what I want to, because I'm going to ask for discussion as we go. I'll be asking you some questions, okay? And I plan to take a break, let's see, at 8:30, but I've had a lot of coffee today, so it might be earlier, okay? All right. It's important that genuine born-again Christians come to recognize their theology as worldview thinking. So at the outset, just let me tell you, I equate systematic theology and worldview, Christian worldview. Christian systematic theology and Christian worldview, to me, are the same thing. Now, most of our studies of worldview, you take a book and it lists, okay, here's the 10 things. It's a comparative. It's comparative religious studies, all these different views, these worldviews, all these different 10 different things or whatever. And those are fine. They're great. but that doesn't tell the whole story. And so I believe that my systematic theology is what I believe about everything. No matter what Gary Gromacki says, Alabama is the best football team ever, not Ohio State. Okay. So that's part of my worldview. Okay. Now, it probably doesn't rise very high and would probably not make it into my systematic theology textbook, but it's part of my worldview. Everything that we think, everything that we have cogitated upon is, and some of it may be loosely there, but it's, and not everything is foundational, but it's part of what I think about reality. And I need to think about reality through the lens of God and his word. And that's systematic theology. Okay. So now most of us do not, my second sentence, consciously pay attention to the process of how we think and put beliefs together to form doctrines which we believe and decide to live by. I will here present to you the process of how Christians should develop their worldview with the Bible as the foundational authority. This is my opinion. It's what you're paying me for. However, this is not a matter of simply finding topics in the Bible and quoting verses to throw at various events and circumstances of life. It involves a detailed process whose ordered steps provide a way to validate what is to be believed and what is to be discarded. This process is the task of doing theology. In the end, I will define systematic theology as both a process and its product, realizing that the process is dynamic, that is, it is ongoing. Product that is obtained along the way in this dynamic process is a Christian worldview. And this set of summary notes is meant to introduce the student to the rudimentary steps involved in doing this theological worldview development. This idea of it being dynamic and ongoing, Dr. Gromacki remembers Dr. Rod Decker, our good friend and colleague at Baptist Bible Seminary, who's in heaven now, has been promoted. I remember Rod and I had many conversations about theology being self-correcting if we follow the right process. Our approach to doing theology is self-correcting. And so it's something that we do over and over and over again. And in that process, we can find where we've missed it and fix it. Now, we're never going to be perfect on that. I don't believe in that. In fact, if we could be perfect on that, there's no room for growth. So my approach, and I've been misrepresented on this in print. A former student actually taught that I was teaching it's a one and done thing in systematic theology, everything's static. Well, I've never taught that, never come close to that. So I don't know what drugs he was taking when he said in my lectures on that. And I hope you guys won't misrepresent me on that. Well, problems in defining systematic theology, because if I were to ask all of you to give me a definition, we would probably be in the same ballpark, but we probably wouldn't be sitting in the same seat in that ballpark. I have found over the years that students often do not understand the discipline of systematic theology, or for that matter, the discipline of biblical theology. Now, what are the majors of all of you guys? Ian, what's your major? Does everybody major in the same thing at Calvary? Gary, how's that work?
This is a unique program, and it's a PhD in Bible and theology. And so we really don't have the majors like at
Okay, so no
BBS.
concentrations. Okay.
Yeah, so everybody's
All right.
getting the Hebrew, the Greek, as well as theology, systematic theology.
Okay, that's helpful. I wanted to make sure I wasn't talking over the head of the Old Testament majors. I have found over the years students don't understand the discipline of systematic theology or the discipline of biblical theology. It's not all the students' fault on several scores. Aren't you happy about that? First, there are as many definitions, it seems, as teachers. Second, beyond that, there's an overlap, especially in the area of how things are to be done in the actual undertaking of these disciplines. So the first one's definitional. I have given you a couple of those files in the notes. In this section, give definitions. One is systematic, one is biblical theology. You want to compare that. I won't take the time here because I don't have the time. The second one here is gets in the process. Third, there's a tradition that has been built up of seeing systematic theology as a kind of deposit of revealed truth rather than seeing it as a task to be done. The deposit of revealed truth is the Bible. My systematic theology, which expresses my Christian worldview, is not revealed truth. It is my expression and application of that revealed truth to all areas of life. I would never claim that my own systematic theology notes are inspired by God, except for the purposes of this class. Okay. Now, the pastor should not, at the end of every sermon, put out a qualifier. What again do I know? You know, we're saying, thus saith the Lord. We're doing our best to do that. Okay, but we understand that our theologizing is not inspired by God like Moses and Isaiah and Matthew and Paul. Okay. Now, on this task to be done, I wrote an article. In fact, it's in the notes. And if we have some time, I'll try to get to it today if we have any time. It's on the essence of dispensationalism. You know, and Calvary's a dispensational school, and so I qualify to teach at Calvary because I'm a dispensationalist. It doesn't mean I hate those who aren't. But we're not you know, we have our differences. They're very strong sometimes, but we don't hate people. But I wrote that article that was first given in a seminary class, and then later I gave it at the pre-trib study group, and then it was published in the first journal that came out for the Journal of Ministry and Theology at BBS. And when I did that article, it was sent over to a lady who taught English at the college. And then her changes came back to me for approval to look at. And when the edited copy came back, she had marked out the word task. I had mentioned that theology was a task. She marked it out and wrote above it the word doctrine. I took my pen and I marked it out and I wrote above it task. I really mean it. But she didn't quite get it. But I think she was following. If she was not a trained theologian, she was an English teacher. Okay. And I think she was following what the average person in our churches thinks. It's just theology is a grocery list of things to believe. And we tack on verses to memorize to support those beliefs. And that's all there is to it. Well, that's certainly an element that's in there, but that's not all there is to it. Fourth, related to number 2 above, there's some genuine semantic differences in the debate over definition. Therefore, it's important for the student to understand where each particular teacher is coming from in use of terminology. For example, the tracing of a particular theme throughout the entire Bible. Notice I've listed a few examples: Son of God, Arm of God, illumination, stars, blood. Is to some interpreters a task called biblical theology. Now notice what categories I did not use. In that right here, what categories did I not use? I intentionally did not use. Yeah, the ologies,
The ologies.
standard ologies. I didn't put bibliology and theology proper and Christology. I didn't use those. I used more narrow examples. Okay. And so some trace like Son of God all the way through the Bible, and that study is part of what's called biblical theology. Others, because such tracing crosses authorial and historical boundaries, see this as more properly under the venue of systematic theology. And that's the way I take that. Okay, I'm in the second group. So I talk about Pauline theology. That's my biblical theology. When I start correlating Paul to Peter, okay, I believe you stepped into the world of systematic theology. We'll talk about that a little more later. What is clear about all of this is that there are levels to the entire process of recognizing intertextuality, with some even using the term intermediate biblical theology to describe the tracing of a theme through the entire Word of God. Fifth, different confessional faiths use terminology differently. The Presbyterians talk differently than Catholics about such issues. Baptists talk differently than Methodists. All one has to do is read the systematic theology work, Blessed Rage of Order, by the liberal Catholic David Tracy, to see readily that what he does in systematic theology is not what I do. Okay, now that's some of the problems. Now another problem is form here. When you turn in a paper to me, never put a heading at the bottom of the page like I've just done here. And I have no idea why it's there, because it wasn't there earlier before I made the PDF. So, but systematic theology as the queen of the sciences. Now, when we get to that, sometimes I have a student, even a PhD guy, will go, well, it's not talking about the king of the sciences. That's not the point of this discussion. Well, it's king or queen, okay? Let's not get into gender debates. We got enough of that in our culture, okay? From the outset, it must be noted that I do not define systematic theology as simply the arrangement of biblical themes in some kind of topical order, Bible, God, Christ, Holy Spirit, etc. Although this would be part of what is done. To define systematic theology as only this activity is a post-Enlightenment way of looking at the enterprise. In this scheme, systematic theology is just one discipline among many, such as mathematics, natural science, and philosophy, each discipline having its own sphere. This is a limitation that I am not willing to accept. Instead of this restricted viewpoint, and I'm going to show you a PowerPoint slide after I get through the next paragraph, even before I finish it. Instead of this restricted viewpoint, I hold to a view of systematic theology that is pre-Enlightenment. So I am ancient. Prior to the Enlightenment, 18th century, theology was often viewed as the queen of the sciences. What was meant by this expression was the fact that theology was the academic discipline where all academic disciplines were integrated. In other words, it was the filter. The result of the integration was a comprehensive worldview with theology as the filter for all truth. That is, all truth claims from various disciplines were validated or invalidated by the prior established truth of theology. Unfortunately, in the Middle Ages, much of Christendom performed this validation process by an appeal to church tradition or historical theology. Many in our own day, although they may not call it systematic theology, perform this validation using some functional form of religious experience. For those who practice biblical Christianity, the validation process must use biblical theology, and the systematic theology built upon that is the filter for all truth. That ensures that the worldview that is the product of the process is in genuine and total harmony with the scriptures. Okay. Do you see my PowerPoint? You probably don't. Do you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. All right. I'm going to leave it like this. So I think if I run it, do you still see it?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. All right. I'm going to keep it like this because I'm more comfortable seeing you while I talk. Okay. This is, I maybe can blow it up a little. Okay. The modern development of systematic theology here is what I'm looking at. Notice some of the things I put here. The Enlightenment or the Age of Reason is basically this, whoops, didn't know that was movable. This century right here, the 1700s, give or take. Now, what event in the 1700s is kind of crystallizes or is kind of the poster event or the Enlightenment? It's an event.
French Revolution.
French Revolution, when was that?
1780, I'm guessing.
Well, you got it in the right decade. It's on the other end of the decade, though, 1789. 1789. And that event, you know, freedom for the French, didn't give them freedom. If you look at that carefully, what they ended up with a reign of terror. Remember that in your history? And they lined up nuns and priests, Catholic Church, throughout the villages and in Paris and everywhere else in the country, and the Jacobins tried to kill them. Now, I'm not a fan of the Roman Catholic Church, but I'm not in favor of lining up nuns and priests and killing them. And of course, they killed the king and the queen. We know the story. It was an anti-authority movement, and of course, the king, I think, brought a lot of it on himself. The Catholic Church brought a lot of it on. They have some responsibility. But it was basically an anti-God, anti-church, anti-Bible movement. And what did they get for that? They had a reign of terror, at the end of which God gave them Napoleon. And what did Napoleon give them? 15 years of European war with maybe just 3 or 4 years off. And ever since then, France has never won a war without anybody else's help. There are consequences in history to decisions. So 1799 is that. And after the Enlightenment, though, in the minds of culture, the burden of proof has shifted. Before then, the burden of proof was on the unbeliever. Now the burden of proof is on us. Do you feel that? Do you sense that in our culture? The burden of proof is on us. Now, one of the things that happen, you know, is the age of reason. So you think about the various ways we can reason: deductive reason, inductive reason, abduction, kind of a combination of those things, verificationalism. But the winner during the Enlightenment period was inductivism, inductive reasoning, empirical analysis. So the idea was it was reductionist. If we could just study everything, every discipline, everything we see in the natural world, because there is no supernatural, we'll study everything and break it down into its constituent parts, we will come to understand all knowledge. And so out of that came a very severe fragmentation of knowledge. So if you look in the 1800s here, and if I had a whiteboard, I would draw it. I'm drawing stuff now. But if I had it, I would do a marks here of lines where we have different disciplines developing, and we're still in the age of fragmentation, and we're still in the age of specialization. I mean, you can go, David, to Penn State and almost get a minor in dream interpretation. Okay. Now, when I my former life, I was an aerospace engineer. I have a math degree with some science background. Today, I could not get the jobs I got in aerospace with a math degree and the science that I had. I have to have a specialized engineering degree. So the specialization continues. It's rolling on. That's a heritage. It's still with us of the Enlightenment. As part of that, systematic theology just becomes one thing in the list. Everything's been broken down. Systematic theology becomes one discipline, and under systematic theology, everything is just a list of things. And that's where the idea of a list, theology as a list, comes from. List of doctrines to believe. And of course, in the human mind can't tolerate such fragmentation. And in the 1900s, there were two responses to the fragmentation, two major responses, I take it. One was the New Age movement, which basically took that fragmentation and made sense out of it by yin and yang it together. You know, provide and a subjective pulling together of those things, and say through that you have some meaning for what all this fragmentation could mean. The other response, by the way, the New Age movement is not a response to Christianity primarily. It's a response to the Enlightenment and the fragmentation. That's what New Age is for. That uneasiness with the fragmentation, and so people search for other things, and they went and grabbed Eastern mysticism. The other response is postmodernism. And postmodernism, I don't think it'll be as long-lived as modernism, because if you don't believe in there's any such thing as truth, you can't really tell anybody that they're wrong. And so I don't think it's going to be as long-lived, but it's very similar to, very similar to the Eastern mysticism. You can be very subjective with postmodernism. And I'll talk a little more about that now. So what postmodernism does, instead of bringing the yin and yang together, it looks at the fragmented list of disciplines and studies and all those things, and gives up on the project of truth. And it enshrines the idea that there is no such thing as truth, and this fragmentation proves it. And so now to have any kind of meaning, you have to find a subset of that, and that's your pluralistic view. That's your view. Everybody else has their view, and they're going to circle something else in that list. Okay, you guys tracking with me here? Give me a thumbs up if you're tracking. Okay. Now, I have a guy's name down here on the left side, Newton, Sir Isaac Newton. Have you heard of him? What's he famous for?
Getting hit in the head with an apple.
Yeah, I got hit in the head with an apple. The guy left us 20,000 pages in mathematics and optics and physics. He's one of the co-inventors of calculus. In fact, these guys, they were so brilliant, they were starting to deal with things, and the math level that they were using, algebra and other things, was not sophisticated enough to deal with the stuff they were looking at and hypothesizing about. So they had to invent their own mathematical language to deal with it, so they could talk to each other mathematically. And that's where calculus comes from. But one thing they probably never told you in school about Sir Isaac Newton is that he left us 3 million words of theology. Have you ever heard that before? 3 million words of theology. Now, it's bad theology. He's Arian. In fact, he has a 220-something page handwritten paper, master's thesis level, doctoral dissertation level, in defense of Arius. So he's Unitarian. He denies the Trinity. But his belief, in the two books, the Book of God and the Book of Nature, he believed that theology was a discipline where everything was integrated together. So he has one leg back in the old days of systematic theology as the queen of the sciences, one leg in the new world, the scientific revolution that's going to precede and be part of and coincide with the Enlightenment. I'm telling you that I'm more like Sir Isaac Newton than I am like Peter Enns or Kevin Van Hooser. Now, they would be Trinitarian, or at least Kevin Van Hooser would be Trinitarian. I'm not more like Newton in that respect. But in terms of how I look at theology, where theology is the discipline where everything comes together. Okay. So I'm a throwback. I'm pre-critical. I'm pre-enlightenment in general. Now, if you look at my next slide there, pre-modern, modern, postmodern. You have supernatural explanations, pre-modern, modernism, only natural explanations are allowed. Postmodernism, you don't need any explanations. Pre-modern miracles, modernism, no miracles. Postmodernism, miracles are back on the table to varying degrees. And our culture reflects that in our movies and other things. High view of the Bible, low view of the Bible, any text is only functional in postmodernism. Pre-modern ecclesiastical authority, reason governed by revelation, and that term down there is dogmatic theology. By that I mean creedal theology. Modernism, natural, no miracles, low view of the Bible, revelation eliminated by the authority of reason. Theology, just another academic discipline. Over here, revelation is existential. Theology is experiential. So all this turns out to be is functional. So we have functional views of inerrancy, functional views of theology, and they do not permit certainty. And that's the main issue we have to fight, gentlemen, as we think about how we do theology and how we view things. I'm going to talk about bibliology some, mostly through the books that we're going to kind of investigate. And is the Bible certain? And then a corollary to that, is the Bible clear enough for it to be certain? Or at least for us to know the certainty that it might have. So let me stop and have you guys ask some questions. I've said a lot here. I'm still on, am I still on page 1 of my document? Page. Now, I'm sure you've seen this stuff before, but you've seen it maybe in a different format, different context. No questions at all? Okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take a 5-minute break because I need to get rid of some coffee. And that'll give you some time to think of a question. And then we'll come back and talk about it. Okay? I'll be right back. Are you still there, Gary?
I'm here, but I'm about ready to leave. So
I have a
Just,
question for you. At the
Mhm.
end of the class, hopefully I'll remember to stop recording. Will it automatically stop recording if I close out the class?
I'm not quite sure about that, the answer to that question, but I'm going to go get something to eat on my way home, and then I'll use my laptop, and I should be on before you're finished, and just to remind you to turn it off.
Okay. Now,
Okay.
when it'll send the recording to me?
No,
Where will it?
The recording will stay in Microsoft Teams, and then tomorrow I will I link it to YouTube video, and then I put it in Canvas. So I'll do
Okay,
that.
so I don't have to do that.
You don't have to do that. I'll do that for
Oh.
you.
All right, I'm happy with that, Gary.
Okay. I'll see
Your work
you.
your way and go, Gary.
Have a good class. See ya.
All righty.
Okay, Prof, I have to log off now to get everything started, but I'll make sure to watch the video recording, and I just set it up so that I can be in class for the next 2 weeks.
Okay,
So
very
I'll
good.
be in for the presentation and for the debate.
Okay, we'll be praying for you.
Excellent. Thank you, guys.
Okay, who we waiting on? Stephen, Eduardo, Christopher. Okay, guys, any questions come to your mind while we're taking a break?
Dr. Stallard, Ian here. I just I was reading through your paper, before we started. I am one of those that was taught that biblical theology is kind of what you said that it wasn't, in terms of really kind of linking themes and ideas and really calling that more biblical theology than systematic theology. My dissertation is on the temple, and so I'm interacting with guys like Beale and some of the others who do the similar thing and call it biblical theology. And I understand part of that is because they're covenant theologians and they have a certain theology to kind of read back into certain books. Is that kind of why and
No,
kind of what you're
No, I
starting to
see those two differences as labeling issues, not substantive issues.
Okay.
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 Because I'll do the same thing.
Right.
There's nothing inherently evil
Mhm.
about tracing the theme of the Son of God through the whole Bible. There's
Right.
nothing evil
Right.
about that. And you can
Right.
learn some things by doing that. I just don't label it biblical theology. Why? Because you lose some context.
Okay.
That's why I do it. And I label things the way I do, mostly to help me keep in the right lanes as I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm one of the guys when I'm because I think when you integrate from one author to another, you're doing something quite different, especially if there's no quoting going on,
Right.
but you're linking them because of common themes or whatever. And there's all kinds of views of why you link. I think you're doing something quite different when you link that way than when you're just doing exegesis through a book of the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
So I prefer to talk about the biblical theology of Romans, the biblical theology of Paul, and biblical theology of Moses, and then we integrate. Now, the liberals back in the day, the whole idea of biblical theology as a discipline really started mostly in the 1900s with I say liberals, neo-Orthodox. They're liberal from our point of view, but they were the back to the Bible guys based on the liberal view. But and they believed the Bible had a bunch of theologies, plural, but no theology.
Mhm.
So yeah, you had the Mosaic theology, and you could link that to Isaiah's. There's Isaiah's theology, but those contradicted each other, and Matthew's contradicted, and Paul contradicted. So you couldn't harmonize them. Well, we disagree with that. I
Mhm.
believe you have these boxes of theology contributions that are unique, and it helps us to think of them as units to help make sure that we are tracking in our exegesis well at that level. And I think we believe, though, that they can be harmonized. But when you're doing the harmonizing of it, I think you've entered into systematic theology in my labeling system. But again, it's not a substantive difference, but I do think the reason I label things the way I do is to put up the guardrails for myself.
Right.
Okay.
Or as you put in here, that's why you say you kind of use it to define the process, so that when you're going to look at these themes, then keep them within their proper perspective of time
You
period
know,
in books. Right.
For example, eternal life in Paul is future.
Mm-hmm.
In John, it's present.
Mm-hmm.
We don't want to read Paul into John or John into Paul.
Right. Oh, okay.
And sometimes it's easy for a pastor or someone just kind of crank right on through, and he's got the same definition for eternal life or the same aspect of eternal life through there because it's the same term. And we lose track of those kind of things, and pretty soon we're standing in the weeds theologically, and we don't know it. So that's why I set up the guardrails that I do.
Gotcha. Thank you.
So in terms of theological method, were you going to talk about that in this lecture, or were you going to put that up, or were you going to talk about that next week? Or
no, this is my lecture on theological method.
Okay, so kind of like the overview of the method that I was taught was like scripturally faithful, Christologically consistent, historically authentic, philosophically and scientifically sensitive, experientially viable, and the Christian community orientated. That's kind of like the overview that I was taught at Dallas Seminary. Do you deviate from that kind of overall structure a lot in your method? Have you adjusted it from GTS's method?
All those things are positive things. But to me, they're not prior things. There are prior things. I go where the Bible goes. I don't want to force any of those issues you just mentioned, force them into, the sensitive about this or that, the other. I don't want to force that into every passage that I'm looking at. So those things I think are more conclusions by which I live at the applicational level. Okay, so the Bible part's not. We're going to be Bible-centered and Jesus-centered. Okay, that's certainly true. But what does that mean methodologically? See, I'm building exegetically to that. How do we know to be Jesus-centered in our theology? Because the Bible leads me to that conclusion. Okay, and I also know to be Bible-centered because Jesus taught me to. So all of that flows, though, from a biblical theology understanding of these things, and we build up to that. So hopefully at the end of my lecture today, you might have a few things to wrap around to see. But my lecture today, all of my lecture today is on theological method. I am giving you how I do theology. And the things you've mentioned, I'm Bible-centered, Jesus-centered, and I prefer Jesus-centered to gospel-centered. Gospel-centered is truncated to me. I prefer Jesus-centered. But part of that's conclusion. So anyway, follow me and track with me, and maybe toward the end we can talk some more about that. And by the way, guys, send me emails. Again, make sure you send it to both my Calvary and my FOI email, because I'll respond more quickly with the FOI email. Okay. One more paragraph in this section. One significant implication of this approach to systematic theology is that it becomes a task to be performed, not just a grocery list of doctrines and passages to be memorized. And now I want to deal with an implication of all of this. Furthermore, this task is ongoing. It never finishes. Since an individual believer's worldview or his theology, remember my equation there, is constantly being updated by several factors, the most prominent being his increased understanding of Scripture. You know, technically speaking, your theology today should not be the same as it was a year ago. It should be better. Yeah, you should still hold to the fundamentals of the faith, but your overall theology should be better than it was a year ago. Okay. And then the second, the most prominent being is increased understanding of Scripture. I used to teach for a school, Bible college. I was a pastor nearby, and I was adjunct for them. And they had in their doctrinal statement this statement: this doctrinal statement will never change. How does that grab you? What does that communicate to you?
There's no room for correction.
Yeah, they were nobly trying to defend the faith once delivered to the saints. But they, you know, the same could be interpreted as, we have decided never to grow in the grace and knowledge of the Lord. Okay, so
And also to communicate that everyone else is wrong because we're the only ones with the truth.
You're right. That's part of it. Yeah. And that certainly was there in that particular group. But this, and I have a second one. Our worldview is being updated by the second thing, encountering extra biblical questions from current culture. This one sometimes leads to a flurry of discussion. In fact, I sometimes will ask this question at this point: can a theologically significant question arise from outside the Bible?
I would say yes.
Okay.
Because everybody knows that God exists. And so everybody has internal questions regarding God and his character.
Okay. All right. There's natural revelation, right? The Bible itself tells us there are some things we can know about God without a Bible. What are some of the things we can know about God without a Bible? I'm jumping ahead a little bit to theology proper, but what can we know about God without a Bible?
Creation.
God has said that he has made himself evident to all men, so that they are without excuse.
Okay, so he exists. Something else in that passage in Romans 1.
Creation.
Okay.
Conscience.
His attributes being seen through creation.
Creation.
We see his power and his Godhead.
Power. Okay. We know that God is there and he's powerful. I don't think Godhead means they understand Trinity. Don't think that's the case, but they understand that there's a God out there, creator God, who's powerful. Anything else we know about God?
We are accountable to him.
Okay. We know that God is angry. The wrath of God is revealed to them. Okay. Do we know that God is good without a Bible? Yeah, in the book of Acts, it says God shows his goodness by sending the rains, giving you crops. And they would know that without a Bible. That's what that passage says in Acts 14. So there's now, it's not a big giant list of things we know about God without a Bible, but they are rather significant things that we know about God without a Bible. Okay, so that's helpful. All right, what else? Can you give me an example of an extra biblical question from current culture?
I've got
Yes,
one
sir.
I'm dealing with in my church right now. I don't know if this is what you're asking for, but related to gender identity.
Okay.
We didn't deal with that in our doctrinal statement in our church constitution, and yet culture demands that we enhance our doctrine so that we address that. Who is man? What are genders? How are we created in the image of God? And how is that all related that we hadn't defined previously?
All right, that's a big deal, isn't it? And Paul never dealt with that, did he? Or if he did, he never talked about it. He lived in a very immoral culture, and maybe there was that kind of stuff going on, but it was not mentioned. Homosexuality was mentioned. But of course, I'm not sure they had the ability to have sex changes back then. So that particular sin has evolved over time. Okay, any other examples?
Like the issue of abortion, the question of significance of human life, that kind of.
Okay. Well, there are some passages in Exodus where that address abortion to some extent. We don't have a full-blown addressing of that. And then maybe Psalm 139 we could apply to that issue. But you're right. It's the level that there's nothing. I don't think the biblical writers envisioned millions of unborn babies being killed. I'm certain that they envisioned aborted babies because that was frequent in the first century, especially in the Egyptian culture, in some of the reading that I've done. And it was the rise of Christianity that stopped abortion in the Roman Empire. There was a thesis done on that by a student at Princeton. Michael Gorman, I think was his name. So, but I think it would just blow Paul's mind or Peter's mind if they saw the numbers of that. One issue I sometimes hear raised here, and I raise it sometimes, is there life on other planets? In fact, I have a published article on that issue. I, as an aerospace engineer, that was a big deal. In the engineering community, it was assumed that there's life on other planets, and when that life is discovered, it will destroy Christianity. That the first contact is the final nail in the coffin of a dying Christian faith. That was their attitude. And when I was an engineer, I never had to pray and ask God to give me an opportunity to witness today because they were waiting on me at the door. That was the community I was in. And that's an issue that the Bible, or that Paul never addressed directly, or Jesus never addressed that. Moses never addressed that. But is it a significant theological question? Some would say no. I say yes as an apologetic issue. It's theologically significant. And if we did have first contact, what are some of the questions we would have to answer? Now, by the way, I don't believe in any sentient life on other planets other than angels.
Would salvation be offered to them?
Okay, right away, we have the missiological question. Do we send missionaries to the Klingons? We got, and if I sign up, I'm going to go to the Vulcans, not to the Klingons. Okay? So that's an issue. and it's very interesting. There's a parallel back in the days of Augustine and Jerome. All the church fathers, and Augustine and Jerome were among them, writing to each other, debating whether there's life on the other side of the globe. They believed in a spherical earth. Is there life on the other side of the globe? And if there is it soulish life? Do they need to be saved? And the Western culture, when we did find America, found the people living here already, and they answered that question with a yes and sent missionaries. But we'd have to repeat that. And of course, missionary deputation just got really expensive to have to go to somewhere else. So yeah, it's a question that would have theological and practical, ecclesiastical importance, but it's not addressed directly by the Bible. Of course, we bring the Bible to bear upon every issue, but it's not directly there. Okay, so that's what I mean by encountering extra biblical questions from current culture. I think the transgender thing is an excellent one. It's in our face right now, all over the place. Okay. Now, all of that's kind of background. I'm going to give you a summary now of the levels of theology. And I'm going to assume some things here with you. I say here the most basic level is biblical theology, a discipline that logically precedes systematic theology. I think any systematic theology that is not based on biblical theology is not worth reading or doing or living by. Okay. I have in a PhD class that I did at BBS on theological method. The whole class was on theological method. Okay, we're not taking a whole class on theological method, but I'd have students present the theological method of some theologian, and they would pick one. One guy picked out Hans Küng, K-U-N-G, Catholic guy. I don't know if you've heard of him. He was well known back in the mid 20th century. And you study him, and you deal with okay, at the biblical theology level, you got to, how does he do exegesis? Well, and the students' section was very short on that part because Hans Küng never did exegesis. His starting point was somewhere else. And so, people, not every guy who calls himself a theologian is doing what we do. Okay. So here the hard work of exegesis and analysis of the text is undertaken with a strong commitment to literal hermeneutics. Now this is old news for you guys. Literal hermeneutics, I'm defining it as grammatical historical approach to interpretation. The word grammatical language context is broad enough in my mind to include figures of speech, symbolic language, literary structure issues, genre issues, all that. I don't need a literary category. I can handle that with just my grammatical. It's a language context, and history, historical context. I don't interpret Moses as if he has the book of Revelation in his hand. I don't interpret Daniel like as if it was 2nd century BC because it wasn't written then. It was written back in the 6th century BC, so I don't interpret it as later. The goal is the intended meaning of the author. Where do I find that? Taking his language at face value and taking into account the author's historical context, not some later or present day context. In this way, the progress of revelation is viewed as extremely significant, since later revelation cannot unravel any clear teaching given in earlier revelation. Now, let me ask a few questions here to kind of place all this. And I need you to respond to me. What's the most important factor in interpreting the Old Testament text? It's a simple answer. It's not really a trick question.
They looked forward to the promise of a savior that had not
Okay,
arrived
you're
yet.
being a little too complicated there.
Not to read the New Testament back into it.
That's part of it.
Yeah, the historical context in which it's written.
Okay. All right. You guys are PhD students. You're way up here. I need to
The
bring you down.
text. The
The
text.
text. The most important factor in interpreting the Old Testament text is the Old Testament text. Now, only some kind of dispensationalist will really say that. And I don't know where you guys are. I don't mean to step on you. But I think, I mean, the PD guys are probably with us on that. I'm a TD guy. I'm a traditional dispensationalist. I don't know where you guys are. Covenant theology believes that the most important factor in interpreting the Old Testament text is the New Testament understanding of the Old Testament text. And there's a recontextualization going on. It's a different world. Okay. Now they do it at different levels. There's a spectrum there, so they're not all at the same place. There, we'll talk about that maybe later. But what's the most important factor in interpreting the New Testament text?
The text.
The New Testament text. Okay. Now, what's the most important factor in doing systematic theology?
All the text?
I'm going to suggest, yeah, I understand you. I understand you. But I would suggest that the progress of revelation is crucial, and that the Old Testament is the starting point for that. Now, in 1988, I did that paper I have on your notes on the essence of dispensationalism. I did it in a seminar taught by Craig Blazing. In that class, I disagreed with what he taught about one thing. He said that literal interpretation is no longer part of the debate between covenant theology and dispensationalism. That both sides do literal interpretation. And I still don't agree with that. And I wrote a paper in response. He gave me an A, in spite of the fact I was disagreeing with him. But in that paper, as I delivered it, like you guys are going to give your papers at the end, I gave it near the end of the class, our semester class. And we had about 8 students in the class, and there were like 3 of them were covenant guys. And during that, I said something that got them visibly angry with me. And I learned something that day. I was kind of taken aback. Why are they mad? I mean, they're mad. It's not just having disagreement in class. They were mad at me. I go, I'm a nice guy. I didn't say it hatefully. And here's what I said. Listen carefully. I said, it would have been possible to write a systematic theology book in 75 BC. In other words, I do the process. I do my biblical theology and make sure my exegesis is in place. And then I integrate across authors in history and I build it up. And I could have, and I put my categories together, my analysis of extra biblical interaction, my application. I could put it all together, have my volume of systematic theology that was valid up to that time, was complete. I guess not valid is the right word, is comprehensive up to that time, based on what God had given to that point. They went ballistic on me when I said that. Now, why would they do that?
They can't conceive of that without the New Testament.
See, their starting point is the New Testament, and I had taken away their starting point. And you notice how this shows up in exegesis in Revelation 20 in the 1,000-year debate. The all mills consistently say we must start here in the debate with the pre-mill guys. Why is that? Because if they're wrong there, they lose it all. That's why they have to come up with something to kill the chronology from 19 to 20. They have to do that. If they're wrong there, it's all gone. Their view's gone. But that's not true for us. If you're with me on my pre-mill position, if I'm wrong about the 1,000 years in Revelation 20, okay, and it's talking about the church age or something, like some rule of Christ in the church age, okay, that still doesn't unravel all the Old Testament teaching of Messiah coming to earth to set up an earthly kingdom. I still have that. So they have to go destroy all those passages. There are a ton of them. So my view doesn't die on that hill. Their view does. So this shows up. These things show up. New Testament starting point versus Old Testament starting point, and I think we follow the progress of Revelation. And I've already said what I've done in the next paragraph. And you guys have had the language and the exegetical classes and the development of biblical theology in those classes, and that's exegesis is the foundation of biblical theology. So I won't labor that point. In the second point, the second level is the integration or synthesis of text across authors and history. When one tries to integrate across authors and historical boundaries of Scripture, there are two areas of vital concern. They're the same two I mentioned before, literal interpretation and progress of revelation. So when I begin to do that, I sling stuff together from the Bible, and I look back at some of my old sermons, which I have on cassette tape, but I will never let you listen to, where I was slinging stuff around pretty naively, which didn't, why? I didn't know any better. And the biblical theology, I hadn't done that work yet in my younger days. So when I begin to put two passages together, and here's one, let me ask it this way. It's a simple question, but I think it highlights the issues. And here's the question. Who tempted Eve in the Garden of Eden?
The serpent.
Okay. Have you ever heard a sermon where a pastor preached it was Satan? Have you ever preached a sermon where you said Satan tempted Eve in the garden? Okay, now when we come to Genesis 3, if I ask a different question, if I say in the garden, it's maybe that's okay to say Satan. But if I say who tempted Eve in Genesis 3, I can't say Satan. Why? If I'm asking an exegetical question, the word Satan is not in Genesis 3. Okay, the serpent tempted. So, but how do I know the serpent is Satan? Not from Genesis 3.
I would argue there's enough in Genesis 3 to know that he's no mere serpent. But
yeah,
you're
but
right.
We would know that he was some kind of adversary.
Right.
So there are hints, but no direct statements.
Yeah. To get to Satan, yes, but to get to more than a serpent, I think it's exegetically in the text.
Unless serpents in
that's
those
not the
days
question
were
you're
different.
asking.
Yeah. Well, we go to other passages to identify the serpent as Satan, do we not?
Yes.
Okay, which is the main passage we go to?
Ezekiel,
Revelation.
28 or
Revelation.
12:9.
Revelation 12.
Yeah.
I mean, it has Satan equals devil equals dragon equals serpent. It's all there for us. It's a neat little passage
12:9
to have it all.
and
So,
20:2.
okay, so we put those two together, and we know that Satan tempted Eve in the garden. But if we're talking about just the Genesis 3 text, we can't go all the way with that. Okay. But what we can say is this, that when I put those two passages together, my synthesis statement, Eve was tempted by Satan. That synthesis statement of the two being put together cannot violate the literal interpretation that I had in either passage. I can't emasculate things. My prior exegetical work still needs to stand when I link from one passage to another. And that involves also maintaining my respect for the progress of revelation in those two passages. So that's one of the issues in linking that, thinking through that. There are other things you have to make decision on, which we don't have time to go in, but how much do you think the New Testament writers are doing midrash? Some of the arguments coming out these days are the New Testament writers are doing a lot of midrash, and therefore you see a lot of verbal analogy where the passages are linked just based upon what words are used rather than what the themes are in those passages. One particular argument is in 2 Samuel 7, the word refers to raising up of Solomon on the throne in one of David's heirs. And the word raise up is the same as the raise up word in Acts 2 when Jesus ascended to heaven. Or when Jesus was raised from the dead, excuse me, raised from the dead. And so those two things are put together to say that the Messianic kingdom starts in Acts 2. That's one way that linking has been done. Others will say, no, I'm going to link Daniel 7, the Son of Man who receives the kingdom, with Revelation, with Luke 19 and Revelation 19, where the Son of Man seems to receive the kingdom at the second coming. So there are different ways people link, and you've got to watch that. I think that is where most of our mistakes are made in doing theology. So you got to slow. I'm just arguing that you slow down. Just slow down as you're linking to other passages and double check. And if some theologian puts a couple passages together, I'll always go read those passages. Just don't accept it. Okay, any other question about that? Okay, the third level is the categorization or systematization of the results of integration at the level of all the canon. This is what systematic theology is known for. The list of ologies, and of course there's usually a prolegomena. I've listed the 10. I've added Israelology here. Okay. A couple of issues. I say in the comments down here, the very last sentence on page 3 here, they are not extra biblical. These categories, if you ask, where did these come from? I constantly hear students say, man-made system put over the scriptures. Well, that's possible in some cases, but they're not extra biblical, as I sometimes hear students claim. Where, I ask, is the category of the Bible in the Bible? Yes. Is the category of God in the Bible? Yes. On steroids. Okay. Is the category of Christ in the Bible? Spirit, all these things, all the ologies, the basic concept and terminology has roots in biblical theology. So it's not extra biblical. Now it can lead to extra biblical things if you're not careful with things. But the categories themselves, there's nothing wrong with the categories. They are actually biblical categories. The issue is, do they integrate? Down here I say each of these categories of the Bible teaching are quite broad and do form a basis for outlining major doctrines taught in the Bible. So are they helpful in integrating all the data that's in the Bible, mostly for use in teaching, remembering and teaching? Now, let me pick on somebody here. David, since you're in Pennsylvania, I'll pick on you. Okay. Let's assume that you're going to write your systematic theology book. Okay, you'll have a beginning prolegomena section. Okay, what's going to be the first section of your book? You know, Van Hooser, for example, starts First Theology, his book, with a combination Bible and God. What's going to be your first section?
Well, I think bibliology should be first because it's the basis from which all the other information we have arises.
Okay, I tend to agree with you. What would be your second one?
Probably like well, either Christology or theology proper.
What? So you got theology proper and Christology. Okay, now before you give me the next one, let me guess what you're going to say. You're going to tell me that the next category is the two witnesses in the book of Revelation. And then you'll go to pneumatology. Did I get that right?
I don't know. It wasn't going there, but
Well, so I'm not a mind reader. Now, that's obviously a silly example, no, but it illustrates something. I'm using absurdity to illustrate something. What's wrong with sticking the two witnesses in this list?
they don't form a larger a larger study that's throughout the whole of Scripture, that's found throughout all of it.
Yeah, they're not even a major integrating category for the book of Revelation.
Right.
I mean, they have their place, but they're like, you know, 5, 6, 7th level down. As you look at those things, and let me recommend to you that when you pick up a theology book, you study the table of contents for a long time before you start to read it. Pick up Charles Hodge and just study the outline at the beginning. You'll be amazed at the things you'll see. You'll see the doctrine of soteriology as a subset of ecclesiology. And stuck between it and, you know, church, and then an indent, actually two indents in his salvation, stuck in between is baptism. Now, he wasn't you have to be baptized to be saved, but baptism was the sign of salvation. It's the infant baptism approach, but you look at his theology and you see those connections by studying the table of contents. So what that tells us is our approach to these categories and how we present them is a matter of providing weight. What do we think things should be weighted as in terms of significance and value for bringing things together? That's why Millard Erickson uses the term stratification to describe it. It's an outlining that provides weight and order to these things. It's, in my opinion, not something that's been foisted onto the Bible by people. Okay, any questions there? No. One of the things I do say as a warning here, bottom of this section, there's a danger that preoccupation with the top of the outline might lead a Bible student to neglect a lesser overall theme, a subpoint in the outline. We don't want to do that. That's why earlier I used Son of God, Arm of God, different themes when I asked that earlier question. Yeah, we want to make sure that the lesser themes have their proper place. You know, if you're 7 or 8 levels down in the outline, you're still weighting them appropriately in that outline. So that's part of our discussion and our thinking as we do theology. But this is what theology is known for. Some people will just define systematic theology as just this level 3, as I presented it here. And what I'm doing, I'm presenting level 1 as biblical theology, level 2, 3, 4, and 5 together is systematic theology. Okay, so level 1, biblical theology, level 2, 3, 4, and 5, systematic theology. And again, this is a summary form. Okay, the fourth level is the validation or invalidation of all truth claims made from sources outside the Bible. That's integration of all truth with the Bible as the filter or judge of truth claims. Now, I don't know if I gave you this paper that I have in my notes. I have systematic theology as model building. I don't think I gave you that paper. But let's talk about what I've stated here as the definition of the fourth level. I'm suggesting that systematic theology evaluates all the truth claims that are made, at least theoretically, all the truth claims that are made in the world. Okay, men can get pregnant. Okay. Guys can be girls, girls can be guys. Okay. You have Sigmund Freud say that all guilt is false guilt. Do you evaluate? How do you evaluate that? Well, you evaluate that by saying the Bible says no, that's not true. There is false guilt, but not all guilt is false guilt. There's true guilt. You have an atheist say there is no supernatural world. So we have to evaluate that. And we make a response to those. So this is the area where we make responses, I think, where the claims that are made out there. And I think the biggest area where we make responses, biggest area that we use is historical theology. This is where I place historical theology. Now, what John Calvin says about things is not scripture, correct? What Luther says is not scripture, but we use them, and we use them up at level 1, but we're going to validate them here. And of course, the cycle keeps going back around again. We keep doing this over and over and over again. Well, my 5 levels give a list of order of validation, but we're starting anywhere. Sometimes I start here, sometimes I start with got an application question, pops into my head and I start there, but I'm going through the cycle here over and over, thinking through how to validate, making sure that biblical theology is first, and building up to my analysis of, okay, should I do this or not? So that's one of the things there, validation or invalidation of all truth claims. The world is flat. Respond to that. Evolution is true. We respond. This is where we respond. So this is also the heaviest. Apologetics is in all 5 levels, but this is probably the heaviest spot for apologetics. Okay, any questions about this? And the 5th level is application. So I include application as part of systematic theology. Some will take this and just say this is practical theology and keep it and make that a separate discipline. But I see it as part of systematic theology. That's a labeling difference, perhaps. I label it the way I do. It keeps me closer to the text because I don't want to go off the rails in terms of application. And there is definitely some off the rails stuff going on out there in the world in terms of application, open theism, redemptive movement hermeneutic, and a bunch of other stuff that's out there that's driving the wagon over the cliff in terms of application. I suggest here you never start with the question, what does the passage say to me? Do we ever get to that question? Is it ever a good question to get to? Yeah, if you're talking about application, once you've developed meaning, see, meaning precedes application. And so we have to have meaning first. And if we can just get that right, then we can ask the question, what does the passage say to me? Okay, what does the meaning of that passage mean for my life? That's significance. Okay, so We work through that. So this is, and part of that's Christian or biblical ethics. It's also lived out sanctification. And maybe some contextualization used in a good way with respect to present culture. As we exegete the culture I'm in, that's part of application. I got to figure out what are these people that are say they're my friends are actually asking me to do. So I got to work through all that. So if you look at the levels, level 1, biblical theology, exegesis, little hermeneutics, progress revelation, foundational for that. And I see the themes developed at the level of authors, Moses, Isaiah, Matthew, Paul. Then I move to level 2, where I begin to integrate, I harmonize all that together. Keeping in mind, I never destroy little interpretation or progress or revelation. In fact, I would say that's true for all 5 levels. Even when I apply, I don't want to do anything there that causes me to destroy little interpretation anywhere. So that all of a sudden I jump in an application that makes me spiritualize a passage. Level 3, categorization, what we're known for in systematic theology. Validation or invalidation of all truth claims made from sources outside the Bible. And the 5th level, application. It's a simple outline, but there's a lot of discussion in the weeds in each one. Okay. Now, any questions before I move on to my other document that I want to talk to you about?
I just ask one question. And maybe you mentioned it and I just didn't hear it. Do you see hermeneutics as preceding all of that?
Yes. In fact, I separate hermeneutics from theological method. I see hermeneutics as the rules and art of Bible interpretation at the exegetical level. And so I see theological method levels 2 through 5 as something else entirely. And it's the proper process for doing 2, 3, 4, and 5. And each of them will have their own issues to deal with. And that process, all those processes discussed are theological method. But in our world right now, in the postmodern world we're in, everything is hermeneutics, everything's theological method. It's all gummed up in the same pot. There's no distinctions made. That's where we are right now. Okay. Did I answer your question there, Christopher?
Yes, thank you.
Question for clarification, because
Okay.
You mentioned open theism in relationship to the 5th level application. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So, but you're not suggesting, I mean, they go off the rails before the 5th level, right?
Yeah,
It's
I think they go off the rails before they even get to the 1st level.
Okay.
Yeah, they're off the rails everywhere. But remember, if they're wrong at level 1, which they are, and their exegesis is horrible in many passages. Why? Because they have a philosophical presupposition against what the Bible says in certain things. But then how they put the passages together, how they categorize, how they do with extra biblical stuff, how they do application. It's all. I mean, how does prayer change if you're an open theist? How you pray to a God who doesn't know the future and is not really in sovereign control of the universe? How do it changes how you pray? And of course, they think they're getting God off the hook. They're not. They're actually putting him on more hooks than classical theism has. So they're really off the rails with that. And redemptive movement hermeneutic is probably worse. So yeah, I'm not a fan of either of them, and they're really at every level we could have a critique of them. But I was just illustrating for that particular point. Okay, good question. Anything else? I'm going to go back to my level 2, integrating from one passage to another. And, and I ask you some questions there about what's the most important factor interpreting the Old Testament text, etc. And I want to just highlight a few things in this paper. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you. I consider it one of the most important papers I've ever written. And this poured out of me in one weekend, just kind of building up in me, just kind of exploded out of me in one weekend. I worked on it some over a few years and published it in '97. The version I'm giving you is my second version. The first version was 1988. This one I presented at the Pre-Trib Research Center, Pre-Trib Study Group. And again, I'm responding to Craig Blazing and his teaching. That little interpretation is no longer part of the debate between covenant theology and dispensationalism. And it's certainly true. There is no covenant theologian today, in my opinion, who will actually argue that we have a right to allegorize prophecy. They will say we're literal with Old Testament prophecy if we do what the apostles did with it, or they'll have some other way of saying it. They'll never say it in the old traditional way. And the old traditional way went out the door probably in the 70s and 80s. But they go back to 1945, and I have a quote in here from that. Let me see if I can find that quote. This is from Oswald T. Allis. Have you heard of him in any of your research? Okay, he was a good man, Presbyterian, Amill, but he loved the Lord. He did a lot of good things against higher criticism. We appreciate the positive contributions that he made. Okay, we don't look at him like we look at the Jehovah's Witnesses. Okay. But he's wrong in his amillennialism, and he's wrong in the way he handled prophecy. In his book, and this comes from his book, I have the details down here, Prophecy in the Church, 1945, into World War II. Here's what he says. Little interpretation has always been a marked feature of premillennialism, and dispensationalism has been carried to an extreme. Okay, so I am an extremist. Okay, I'm an extremist. We have seen that this literalism found its most thoroughgoing expression in the claim that Israel must mean Israel, and that the church was a mystery unknown to the prophets and first made known to the apostle Paul. Now, a lot of dispensationalists might say about Paul there. It's first made known to Paul and the apostles. In Ephesians 3, it mentions the other apostles as well as Paul. So sometimes we forget that. Now, if the principle of interpretation is adopted that Israel always means Israel, that it does not mean the church, then it follows of necessity that practically all of our information regarding the millennium will concern Jewish or Israelitish age. Now, what's he saying? He said, if we follow little interpretation, the dispensationalists are right. This is where you end up. And of course, the last part, that bothers them to have an Israelitish age. That is as Lanier Burns called it, an Israeli flavored view of history. Where Jesus comes back, and where's his headquarters? Is it in Washington, D.C.? No, it's in Jerusalem. And the kings of the earth come up to him in Jerusalem. I think Alice understood the issues, but what he argues is that I have the right to allegorize prophecy. So he does, I think, was the common view in that day is not the common view today among covenant guys, because they were getting beat up so bad on that issue. They moved, and they've come up with other ways to talk about things. To some extent, you'll still see some of the old guard around, but I think the arguments have been changed a little bit. But then I have a quote from George Ladd. You familiar with George Ladd? Read any of his stuff? Okay, you've heard of him? This is in the book, 1974 book, I believe it was, The Meaning of the Millennium, Four Views, edited by Robert Klaus. Klaus was the post-mill, and he was the editor of the book, and Ladd represented historic pre-mill. I consider this an extremely important quote to analyze. He says the main point is that many Old Testament passages which applied in their historical setting to literal Israel have in the New Testament been applied to the church. Would you say that's a true statement? Is that true or not? We might quibble with the word applied. I mean, the New Testament writers do seem to borrow imagery from the Old Testament at times and apply it to the church. I mean, the church are priest and kingdom of priests, just like Israel was. For example, Revelation 1 says that about the church. So the answer is yes, that's true. Again, I'd like a little more precision about the word applied. Okay. The second sentence, what does all this have to do with the question of millennium? Just this. The Old Testament did not clearly foresee how its own prophecies were to be fulfilled. Interact with me on that one. Well, maybe then read the next two sentences. They were fulfilled in ways quite unforeseen by the Old Testament itself and unexpected by the Jews. With regard to the first coming of Christ, the Old Testament is interpreted by the New Testament.
Well, I'd say the only aspect that was unforeseen was the rejection of the Messiah and a delay in the arrival of the kingdom.
Okay. All right. Anybody else?
I think the Old Testament did foresee a rejection, like the servant songs in Isaiah. Cursed is he who hangs on a tree. So maybe I'm missing what you mean by that, Todd. But
yeah, I would agree, but I don't think to the full extent of like that there would be a delay of the kingdom. But
right.
Well, what we do know is that the first century Jews did not read the Old Testament that way. They in fact, some like the Qumran community, if that's the Essenes, I had two messiahs. Remember that? They have two messiahs. Ben Joseph, Ben David, Ben Joseph to die, Ben David to reign. So they saw that those two things. I mean, because there are two major passages where Messiah is killed when he comes. Daniel 9, Isaiah 53. And before Jesus, most of the Jewish interpretations That was Messiah, not Israel. That's changed over time. They, the idea unexpected by the Jews is certainly true in their experience, but that has nothing to do with the interpretation of the text. They wanted Messiah to come and rule and reign. Get the Romans, have Jesus, the ones who love Jesus have him walk in the triumphal entry and just speak the word and use his spooky powers and have all the Roman soldiers drop dead. That's what they wanted. But they didn't remember those other passages, or they ignored them, most likely. And sometimes when you're under oppression, maybe that's what you do. I don't know. So unexpected by the Jews, but their expectation of a Messiah to rule and reign and destroy the enemies of Israel was not a wrong expectation. It's just the timing of it is wrong for them. See, we solved the problem of the death and reign of having both a death and a reign of Messiah with one Messiah coming twice instead of two Messiahs. So, and of course, the Old Testament did not clearly foresee how. Isn't that the wrong question? So they didn't know that the name of the Messiah was Jesus Christ of Nazareth. They didn't know he was going to die on a Roman cross, but they knew Messiah was coming and he was going to die. He'd hang on a tree, whatever that meant. They knew he was going to die. And they didn't know when. At least, maybe the Daniel 9 prophecy gives a way to get to it. Okay. I'll give him a pass on that one because that's a tough little passage. But they mostly ignored it. So the fulfillment is not something that's usually an exegetical teaching in an Old Testament text. It points to a fulfillment. The fulfillment is later. And it's the New Testament that reveals to us what the fulfillment is. So we need to be careful about that. The way this whole thing was, this paragraph was worded a little bit. Of course, he was setting up his idea. The Old Testament's interpreted by the New Testament. Well, wait a minute. The Messiah was to be born in Bethlehem. Is that a reinterpretation? No. Now, the second paragraph, although it has some bad things in it, has one good thing in it, which has really helped me as I wrote this article. It really crystallized some things for me. Okay. Here is the basic watershed between a dispensational and a non-dispensational theology. Dispensationalism forms its eschatology by a literal interpretation of the Old Testament, and by the way, a lot more than eschatology. And then fits the New Testament into it. A non-dispensational eschatology forms its theology from the explicit teaching of the New Testament, confesses that it cannot be sure how the Old Testament prophecies of the end are to be fulfilled. He's a little agnostic there, right? 4a, the first coming of Christ was accomplished in terms not foreseen by a little interpretation of the Old Testament. Do you believe that? I think that's a bit strong. I don't accept that. And there are unavoidable indications that the Old Testament promises to Israel are fulfilled in the Christian church. I think there's application of some things to the church. We share God, we share kingdom, we share a lot of things. But the promises to Israel, they're going to get. Okay, so, but what is in here that I like? What I like in here is he raises the question of starting point. I've already asked you that. Okay, this is where that really crystallized in my head. And then I presented the paper and I mentioned to those guys in my class, could write a systematic theology book in 75 BC, and they go ballistic. Because they can't do their theology here. They can't do it. I took away their pencil. They can't do it. Okay. All right, everybody tracking with me here? Now, I'm assuming some things about literal interpretation. I do want to highlight, back in the, shortly before I wrote this article, Darrell Bock had a 2-series article in BibSac on the use of the Old Testament in the New. And I went through his 4 things. Well, maybe I ought to do this one first. I bring up Poythress. Is this the right place for it? No, I think I'll pass this section. The priority and harmonization of the Old and New Testaments. Okay, see, and I believe in the priority of the Old Testament for Old Testament interpretation, the priority of the New Testament for New Testament interpretation. But in the harmonization of the two, we follow the progress of Revelation. Covenant guys do not. Okay. Here's Darrell Bock. He gives 4 schools of thought on use of the old and the new. Now this is the 80s. Okay, so that's a lot of water under the bridge sense. But I think there's still some of these categories have hardened. There've been some subcategories developed since then, but I think the truth is still there. He talks about the full human intent school represented by Walter Kaiser. For example, Kaiser handles Hosea, the quote in Hosea about my out of Egypt I've called my son. Hosea 10:1. He handles that. Jesus was literally in seed form in Israel when they left. So he's there. So he handles that in a seminal way and has a rather literal approach. Second school is the divine intent human words view. And you have, here's S. Lewis Johnson, a dispensationalist. Hacker, who is not, was reformed. Elliot Johnson, a good friend of mine, dispensationalist. So on that one, walks through that. And then I think I missed one somewhere in there, but this is the key. This is the one I wanted to talk about. It's Bock's discussion of the school called Canonical Approach and New Testament Priority School, because this is where most covenant guys live today. New Testament priority. Okay, and the extreme of that's Bruce Walkie. I don't know. Have you seen Bruce Walkie's Old Testament theology? Okay, you ought to go find it in the library or somewhere. If you want to buy it and have it, there are 2 pages where he discusses why dispensationalism should be blamed for 9/11. Now, Bruce Walkie used to teach at Dallas Seminary. He converted to Covenant. And he's probably worse than Covenant now. You know, he's part of BioLogos and all that. So, but let me walk through this. Here's the Old Testament must be read in light of the whole canon. The Old Testament must be read in light of the whole canon. The New Testament takes priority in the application of this principle by unpacking the literal meaning of the Old Testament. And what appears to be a rejection of Walkie's position, Bock states, and by the way, Bock, I sent this article to Darrell Bock, and he gave me his blessing for this article. So he agrees with me in the article. Okay, so Walkie's position is that the whole of the Old Testament is to be reread ultimately in light of the New Testament. As a result, the original expression of meaning within the Old Testament passage is overridden and redefined by the New Testament. Such a wholesale shift of reference to the exclusion of the original sense is actually a shift of meaning. In fact, I believe Walkie says you cannot understand a single verse in the Bible until you've read the whole Bible. Okay, now, what is that? This is a scholar talking. not a Sunday school teacher who's never been to seminary. Hebrew scholar, Old Testament scholar. What's the main problem with the fact you have to read the whole Bible before you can understand any single verse?
You exclude the original audience and author of the during the progress of Revelation.
Yeah, Eduardo, excellent. You get an A for today. Did God expect the children of Israel to understand the Ten Commandments when they were given? Absolutely. Do this, you get blessing. Do this, you get cursing. Did he expect them to understand that? He has to. And so that theologizing like that. And in fact, I don't think, let me say it this way. I don't think the covenant guys, when they do their Old Testament exegesis and their Old Testament theologies, I think they don't do what he suggests. But when they go do their systematic theology, they forget what they did. I think I see a lot of that going on there. But again, Eduardo's right. Progress of Revelation is violated. When you do that in the original audience, God expects them to understand. So that's a problem.
And Prof, question. So
Yes, sir.
for me, one of the major issues with the covenant approach is I think it impugns the character of God, because it ignores what he originally promised to the original audience. Is that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And of course, dispensationalists have brought that up for decades, that you're tampering with the character of God. I pastored, when I was at Dallas Seminary in the Ph.D. program, I pastored a church in Arlington, Texas, about 3 miles on the same street where the Dallas Cowboys now play football, that street. Okay. And I once asked John Walford to come over and speak at my church, and he did. And John Walford was in his late 80s at the time. I think he lived to be 92. I took him to the Arlington Steakhouse there in Arlington, Texas. Him and his wife, me and my wife, and we were chatting, and I asked him this question. I said, Dr. Walford, what's the most important issue facing dispensationalism today? Now, this is in about 1991. And he kind of shook his jowls at me and says, young man. I was a young man back then. Says, young man, it's what it's always been. The inerrancy of the Bible. Then I got a little lecture from him about how the truth of God through the inerrant scriptures cannot be maintained in non-dispensational systems, because they have to force fit unity, like taking a square peg and putting a round hole, and they have to do all the fudging and this and that and the other, and it doesn't come across clean. And he says, dispensationalism, you have a shot at being clean. Not that we're perfect at it, but we have a shot at being clean. That's the way he said that to me. And I'll never forget that answer that he gave to that question. Let me see if I can find, trying to find a section of my paper here. Hold on. Well, here's my charts. Here we go. These are broad points here. These are, don't relate this to my list of level 5 levels. This is a more high level. No, that was pretty high level summary. This is even higher level summary. And it's nothing that's new. First, I talk about the recognition of one. This is the dispensational order. recognition of one's own pre-understanding. I know that's problematic. I believe everyone has a pre-understanding. What I don't believe is that we're trapped by it. That's what postmodernism says. We're trapped by it. I don't believe we're trapped by it, but I think we have it. Then the formulation of a biblical theology from the Old Testament based upon literal interpretation. I'm using a more general use of the term biblical theology here in my labeling. Then the formulation of biblical theology from the New Testament. I get the New Testament stuff in order. And then I produce a systematic theology by harmonizing all the inputs in 2 and 3. So the importance is Old Testament is first, New Testament second. Okay, just like we've been talking about. Now, when you go look at the non-dispensational sequence, have the biblical theology of the New Testament based upon literal interpretation of the New Testament text. That seems to be a little problematic without the progress of revelation in place. The formulation of a biblical theology of the Old Testament based upon New Testament, and then the harmonizing. And then I analyze this, and I say a few things, and I'm going to go to my second problem. And again, I want you to read the whole paper when you get a chance. The second problem is that at point number 3, the grammatical historical interpretation of the Old Testament is subordinated to the conclusions of New Testament biblical theology in their scheme. In other words, it's their interpretation of biblical theology from the New Testament. In essence, this is the abandonment of the literal interpretation of the Old Testament, at least in eschatology, and is the basis of the classical debate about literal versus allegorical interpretation. Too much room is given for undoing or replacing the results that would have been obtained in performing a true biblical theology of the Old Testament. Because the dispensational approach at the point of bringing in the New Testament has the Old Testament biblical theology in hand, the approach becomes one of enhancing or expanding. However, on the other hand, the Old Testament is almost an afterthought to the non-dispensationalist who uses the New Testament like the presidential power of veto over exegetical results in the Old Testament text. When the non-dispensationalist comes to the Old Testament text with the New Testament in hand, the truth he finds appears to be a scaling down of what he already has. Consequently, there's a tendency to leave off grammatical historical interpretation in order to make the Old Testament text sit at the same level of his New Testament truth. And this is in stark contrast to the dispensational model, which sees the priority of the Old Testament text and the formulation of Old Testament biblical theology. Now, what's driving the tendency? The New Testament sits at a higher level than the Old Testament, and they got to do something. What is it that what's driving that wagon for non-dispensationalists? And I would suggest you go back to my 5 levels. It's something that has to do with level 3. They have elevated something in level 3 too high in their system. What would that be?
Soteriology?
What's that? Can't quite hear you.
I took a stab at it. I said soteriology.
You're right, but you're right. Let's be a little more precise.
Redemption.
In particular, it's individual soteriology, individual redemption.
Yeah.
That's the lens by which covenant theology reads everything. You go look at Charles Hodge, you see that so clearly. And when you come to the Old Testament, the Old Testament has individual redemption in it, correct? Yes, but it also has a bunch of other stuff, community and national promises to Israel just coming out your ears. The New Testament has some of that, but the New Testament focuses more on individual redemption. That's their centerpiece. That's what drives them to go backwards. And so when they read the Old Testament, they're looking at it through the eyes of individual redemption. They have elevated that level 3 too high in the outline. And it's blowing things up. And of course, it's all tied with level 2. They're going backwards now when they do that. So that's a very important thing to do now. And I suggest that why is our sequence the best? And I go back to progress of revelation. Okay. That's the, Progress Revelation is the historical part of his grammatical historical interpretation. It's not really something different, it's part of it. So that means the dating of books, for example, is not as important to covenant guys as it is to dispensationalists. Okay. Well, I'm going to leave off right there. Let me ask you any questions you have for this.
So back to, so you would say the primary driver in what motivates them to elevate the New Testament to flip the progressive revelation order is their focus on individual redemption. Or is there, because as you were talking about that, I was kind of pondering it just seems so logical and reasonable to begin with the Old Testament. So what would cause someone, do you think it's that alone, or are there other factors that are motivating them
Well,
to
in
move toward
history, in the history of the church, there were other factors. Remember that amillennialism reigns in the church for 1,300 years. And one factor is not the only one. In fact, I say that amillennialism owes more to Plato than it does the Bible. So you have Platonic influence in the 2nd century begins to build up. You have Gnostic influence start to build up. And by the time you get in the 3rd century, now it's starting to roll with Origen and other guys, and Augustine enshrines it in the 300s. And then amillennialism has a stranglehold. There is premillennialism still existing. We know that. It never goes away. I've never seen postmillennialism early. I don't see that till later, after the Reformation. But with some trying to make a case for it, I'd like to study that and see what happens. But it's not till the Reformation pushes back to a more literal interpretation, and now people start applying that to other things, and now you see the rise of, or the resurgence of, premillennialism again. So there is another factor, and that's anti-Semitism. Now, don't misunderstand me here. I'm not accusing covenant guys today of automatically being anti-Semitic because of their replacement theology. But they need to be historically aware that in the roots of the development of amillennialism was a strain of anti-Semitism. Israel was kaput. God judged them, put them away. They're evil. Now, if you go, for example, do all of you have a copy of Matthew Henry's commentary that you never use? A lot of pastors have Matthew Henry. Okay, I've got a copy of Matthew Henry. I think I've got it in 6 volumes. Okay. If you read his commentary on Luke 1, where Gabriel comes to Mary to tell her about the virgin birth, he goes through the whole thing and he takes it all literally, except the part where he, Jesus, will sit on the throne of his father David and rule over Jacob. Everything else is literal. The virgin birth, the predictions, the miracle, it's all literal, except that. He says that can't be referring to the Israelites in the flesh. And he gives 2 reasons. They did not enter into his, Jesus' interest. That is, they didn't get saved. They rejected him. And number 2, Israel doesn't exist anymore. Now, on his Google Maps, there was no Israel, right? He wrote early 1700s. I think he died 1701 or something like that. So as Puritan father, he did a lot of good writing in there, but right in the middle of a passage, he just allegorizes right away. He gives 2 reasons. Israel has rejected Christ, so he has rejected them. And there's that belief that's entrenched there. And that those of us who are different, who believe Israel will be called back to the Lord one day, we're actually supporting unbelief today in Israel. So it's interesting debate, but I think there's that strain of it that's there as well, Todd. But again, the lens, I'm trying to see if I can find it here. Here it is. I'll do this and then I need to take another, well, we're almost through, so I may not do that. I'll hold on here. It would not open that one. Let me come down here, PowerPoints. Okay, do you see this, guys?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay. All right. I want you to notice this is the boring pastel colored chart for covenant theology. And here's the exciting, colorful chart for dispensationalism. Okay. Just know that boring, exciting, boring, exciting. Okay.
That in itself is convincing, persuasive.
Here you have the covenant of grace. See, you have the fall, covenant of works with Adam in the garden. Then you have the fall. And here's the covenant of grace covers all of this time period. And it's a focus on individual redemption through election. And of course, the individual redemption in the church is emphasized in the New Testament, but in the Old Testament, it's there, but community and national promises to Israel are, nor downplayed by them. They're all over the place. They dominate. And this is the basis. This focus on individual redemption is the basis. It's their Achilles heel. That's part of their New Testament priority of reading back into the Old. So that's where I'm talking about that. Okay. Any other questions? I'll try to remember to put that those diagrams in the notes so you guys can have them.
I know you mentioned earlier about, can you hear me okay?
Yes, go ahead.
You mentioned earlier about the importance of dates, the dating of the biblical books for dispensationalists because of the progress of Revelation. When we took our Old Testament synthesis classes, we were looking at something more like a canonical criticism, how the Old Testament was structured in the Hebrew Bible is different than kind of like the more chronological way we have it in the English Bible. I guess the way the Septuagint did it, the kind of English translations sort of adopted that. But there's a lot of lexical links between the books, the way they're arranged in the Hebrew Bible. I think dispensationalists would be should look at that a little closer. Not that it affects the system as a whole, but just that we emphasize the progress of Revelation so much that that I think it would help us to actually look at how the ancients were reading it and why they arranged it the way they did. For example, having Ruth after Proverbs 31, having Malachi right before Psalms, and then Job right after that. They kind of tell a story. So I think there's something to that. I just don't know how that would relate to dispensationalism. So I think we just need to be careful.
My own view is that the arrangement highlights certain themes that already exist, but it doesn't affect exegetical work.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. That's kind of what how I'm thinking about it. So Yeah, I'm
We
glad
just
you framed it
highlight,
that.
the arrangement highlights certain themes. And even in Jewish circles, there have been changes in history. For example, Jesus calls Daniel a prophet, but in the Jewish Bible, Daniel is not in the prophets. Daniel, as a government bureaucrat, is in the writings. You know, he's right before Ezra and Nehemiah. And so, and right after Esther. So later on, though, the Jews in the first century were starting to talk about Daniel in relation to the prophets. So there's a shift. Now, they never did restructure the Bible. They could have to highlight that particular issue because Daniel was a prophet with his visions and dreams. But that wasn't emphasized. He's put in the writings probably because he was an administrator primarily and was well known for that. I hate to call him a government bureaucrat because that's such a dirty word these days, but that's what he was. He was a good one. He was a good one.
Such a one never existed ever again.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, I think I have finished everything I wanted to kind of sling at you today. Want to give you an overview of how I talk about theology and how I visualize doing it in a thumbnail sketch. You know, and I may throw out terminology throughout, and you might not understand me if you hadn't gotten the framework of this. I don't know. We'll see how things go. The rest of the, you know, there may be a few little windows of time for me to pontificate, but by and large, all the classes to come, you're the guys that are going to speak, and I'm going to be interacting with you, and the other guys will be interacting with you as we go through. So we'll see how that goes. Let me, before I let you go, let's okay, do you see the course? Okay. Let's look at next week. Continue reading and, you know, post-it notes as much as you can. You know, you can skim some of my notes. You don't have to read them as thoroughly as you do the other stuff. I know you've got plenty of stuff to read, but at least get the gist. You know, the article we just went over, I'd like for you to go back and read that thoroughly. You have to read the book Defending Inerrancy by Geisler. I hope you've already started on that book. And you should come to class with questions to ask based on the reading. In addition, you have to write a 6-page double-spaced analytical book review. And by analytical, I mean, I don't want just a summary. I want you to give me enough of a summary that lets me know that you read the book. But then the main part of the book is analysis. Tell me what's good about the book, what's not, in your opinion. Okay. And then I did have these articles, kind of read and study them the best you can, just kind of walk through those. And read the Allison section. A lot of reading. This is the heaviest week of reading, I think. It won't be the hardest week necessarily. Doing your research paper might be the hardest thing. If you haven't, you know, you need to start on that now, if you haven't already, your research paper. Because it's, you know, coming down at the end and putting it all together in a hurry. It may not explode out of you like my one paper did. That's the only time that's ever happened to me, to be honest, to tell you the truth, okay? Okay, and I've given this 5 students. You're on tab for that. So let me go back and look at the double check the students who are Okay, here are the assignments. Ian, David, Christopher, Stephen, and Todd for next week. And again, think of it in terms of let's try. That's 5 of you. No more than 30 minutes, right? Let's do, and that's 20 minutes for your presentation, allow room for discussion, 30 minutes total. And if we get to 30 minutes and you're halfway through, we stop. Go to the next guy. We're going to kind of keep it rolling unless there's some questions that are emerging there that the class really needs to wrestle with. Okay. Thank you guys for putting up with me today. Now the rest of the classes I put up with you.
Hey, Mike,
Dr.
thanks for your lecture tonight. And let me just mention to the guys, cycle 4, January and February goes by very, very, very fast. As you know, only 28 days in February, and then we're into March. And that's actually the last week of the of this course, which is like March 2nd or 3rd, somewhere around there. So there's a lot of work to do in this course. So get going. Don't wait. Don't delay on this. And as Mike was saying, a lot of reading. So sort of space that out. Put yourself on a schedule to get the reading done. And just a reminder for the theology courses, we have 3 of them. The goal is to not only have you defend our dispensational premillennial theology and explaining it, but it's to get you to read and reflect on different theological views. And the reason for the debates is to get you to articulate different scholars' views, and then for the discussion to happen to help you to critique those. So I want you to begin to think theologically in that sense, to be able to, as Mike has been sharing the theological method here, and different scholars will approach doing theology in different ways. Get down to that philosophical level in terms of your debate and discussion, talking about, what's their pre-understanding and, is the New Testament priority view. Want to see those type of discussions as you begin to critique. And the whole goal of this last year of the program, and you guys got started with that with, looking at Walton, critiquing Walton and the biblical creation view, his view of Genesis 1 and 2, is to get you to read somebody that you don't agree with and critique them. Understand their arguments and critique them from our dispensational premillennial perspective.
Okay, I have nothing else, guys.
Dr. Stallard, I had one question. Just on
Okay.
our papers, should we just send you an email to your Friends of Israel email and the school one, just to say, hey, this is the topic we're looking at, and get your thumbs up?
Yeah, that'd be great. Be happy to help you out with that.
Thank you.
Yeah, and if you remember back in I'm just teaching dissertation research again to the 3rd cohort. If you remember back to that course that I taught, we had you look at various systematic theologies. So I want you to think about that in regards to this course, and also in regards to your dissertation. So we've got a lot of systematic theologies out there coming from different theological viewpoints. So as you think about writing your research paper, it'd be great to see you interact with some of these different systematic theologies, and look at their arguments for their views and critique, critique their exegesis, critique their theological perspective. And if you can find one, especially that relates to your dissertation topic, that would be great. Your research paper that relates to these topics, but also relates to your dissertation.
Okay. Any other questions? All right, gentlemen. Go take a long nap.
All right, Mike, you know how to turn off your recording now, right?
And go here.
To the three
Stop
dots.
recording.
Yeah.
Yep, I got it.
Great.